Hey everyone, this is Dirk at DPG Off-Road, and today we're going to be installing our ultimate kit from our Spartan series of suspension kits for the JK Wrangler. Let's go to work. Alright, so this is our Spartan series ultimate kit. This is one of our hybrid packages that we use. We've been doing Old Man Emu JKS hybrids for the better part of 20 years. Fantastic suspension packages. Pretty simple package really. We're replacing our coil springs, shocks, sway bar links, track bars with JKS disconnects, sway bar links, track bars, brake line brackets, and we couple that with Old Man Emu coils and shocks. These kits come with the option you can run JKS disconnects on the front sway bar, or if you have a Rubicon model with an in-cab disconnect, we can run the fixed links on the front for a lower price, or if the Jeep is new enough, depending on the coils we use, we can also move the rear factory links to the front and the price is lower even yet. We're going to install this package in my personal home garage today. We're not going to use a lift or anything extravagant. This is just the way most of our customers would be in their own personal garage. So we wanted to do that just to demonstrate that it's a pretty simple, straightforward installation. The shocks in this kit are used. These are takeoffs from my personal Jeep. This customer is a friend of ours, and these shocks are in perfectly good shape, but I live on a gravel road, and so they've had a little bit of rock spray, but they're less than a year old, so they're good for our application here today. Let's get started putting on these parts. So we're going to start on the rear suspension first, and we're just using a floor jack and jack stands. We're going to jack the Jeep up by the center differential, place jack stands under the frame, and remove the wheels. Alright, so we've got the Jeep supported on, the frame is on jack stands in front of the axle. We've got the floor jack under the differential so we can raise and lower the suspension with the jack. And we're going to start dismantling this suspension. The very first thing we want to do, actually, we generally want to get in here and loosen all of our control arm bolts, upper control arms, lower control arms. The factory control arms have rubber bushings in them, and when they're torqued, they're loaded at that position. So we want to loosen all of these bolts, upper and lower, front and rear, before we proceed. So this is an old factory control arm that came off of a build we did years and years ago. But just to demonstrate why we want to take the torque off of these rubber bushings, if the bolt's loose, the arm can spin, but as soon as you clamp that bolt down and tighten or torque that control arm in place, the bushing really wants to sit. So when you lift the Jeep, you're going to put a taller spring and you're going to push that arm down to a different position than it was. But that loads that bushing. The bushing will move up and down with the suspension, but it doesn't spin, it will twist. So we want to have it in a neutral position when we're installing that suspension. So when we get that Jeep back down on the ground, we're going to re-torque all of these control arm bolts at the new ride height so the bushing is in a neutral state and it's not loaded at that point. Otherwise, if you don't do that, you push the arm down, put your lift kit in, and that bushing is in a state of load, and it's hard on the bushings, and it makes a difference. If you're in tune with your Jeep, you can feel that, and it can do funny things to your ride height as well. So we want to always loosen all these bolts up, install the suspension, re-torque the bolts at the new ride height. So on these wheels, the mounting surface on the back is flat. The issue with that, or the difference that makes, is from the factory on the front and rear brake rotors, the factory uses these little retaining split washers on here, and they set off of the rotor a little bit, and so that can affect how the wheel sets up against the rotor. So we want to take those off and get rid of those little washers. Fun. We're gonna dismantle the rear suspension and droop it down so we can get the coil springs out. And there are some things that we need to loosen up first. These emergency brake cables, the factory uses this little bracket assembly to retain these, but we need to bring them out of there to droop the suspension down. So to do that, we just pull the cable around and pop it out of the bracket just like that. Same thing on the other side. A couple of things when we're drooping this rear suspension down to get these coils out. We've got this brake line. It's a little too short for as far as we need to droop the axle. So we just take a little trim tool, and it's just got the little pop rivet, little push pin that goes into the frame. We pull that out. There's another one here if we need it. We can pop out, but that'll give us a little more line to droop that suspension down. We're also gonna remove the factory brake bracket for the rear brake line, and we're gonna install the JKS extension brackets to lower that down a little bit as well. But for now, we'll pull that out. I believe that's a 10mm bolt to remove that. And we're gonna remove the factory sway bar links, shocks, and track bar, and then we'll droop it down and the coils will come out. We'll go right back in with the new stuff. Okay, so we're going to remove the factory shocks, the factory track bar, one bolt on each side, and the factory sway bar links on both sides of the vehicle. Droop the suspension down and the coils will come out. So we've removed our factory rear sway bar, our sway bar links, and our shocks. We've got our brake lines loose. Our sensor lines are loose. So we're going to go ahead and droop this axle down now and remove the rear coils. Keeping an eye on all those parts, make sure that nothing gets bound up there. And then the factory coils just come out. There's a factory rubber isolator on that coil. We will reuse that on the new coils. So we've removed our factory rear coil, shocks, sway bar links, and track bar. We're gonna go right back in with new Old Man Emu coils, new used Old Man Emu shocks, track bar, and JKS rear sway bar links. The JKS rear links are adjustable, so we're going to cut those to length to install in the Jeep. So with the suspension fully drooped and the factory isolator on top of the spring, we're going to go ahead and install the coils back in the Jeep. Just like that. As we come back up, we'll put pressure on it and make sure it aligns in the mount on the top. We don't want it in there crooked. So with the coil sitting in place, we're going to jack the axle up and put some pressure on the coils. Let's double check and just make sure they're seated correctly on the top, which is basically just centered over that mount. We're looking good here. So we're going to go ahead and jack this on up further and put some pressure on these coils, and then we'll start reassembling the rear suspension. So our new track bars are adjustable. So at the new lift height, regardless of where the Jeep started or what the final lift height is, the adjustable track bar will allow us to perfectly center the front and rear axle from side to side. So we start getting a measurement on the stock, center to center on the mounts, and then we'll preset our adjustable track bar just to get a starting point. And I like to start with about 5/8 of an inch longer than stock, just to stick the track bar in there and get a starting point. And then once we have the Jeep back down on the ground, we'll do our final adjustments and make sure the axles are perfectly centered. Beautiful. So that gives us a starting point, and then once we get the Jeep back down on the ground, we'll actually know the ride height. We'll do the final adjustment of the track bar with the Jeep on the ground. We unhooked our diff breather tube while we had the axle droop, so we'll just push that back on. And then we'll go ahead and install our shocks, sway bar links, and brake line brackets. Okay, so we're going to install the JKS rear adjustable sway bar links, and these are made extra long and then they're cut to whatever length you need for the application. So in this case we need a center to center length. When the link is finished, center to center will be 11¼ inches, I believe is what we measured. So to achieve that, we need to cut the links 1¾ inch off of each end. So we put the jam nuts on the link to start with. I've been doing it for years with an angle grinder and a cutoff wheel. Whatever method you use is fine. So we cut the length and then we use the jam nut, take it off to open the thread up, and it's good to go. So we've got this first one in the vise. We'll go ahead and cut it off. Okay, so we've got our JKS rear sway bar links cut to the proper length to go back on our sway bar. Then we've got our JKS brake line extension brackets, which the factory brake line was in the frame. So we just take that bolt out, remount the JKS bracket, and then we move our factory brake line down to mount to the JKS bracket. We'll bolt that together, and then we'll throw the wheels on. So we've got our shocks, our rear sway bar links, brake line extension brackets, coils, track bar, all installed, and the track bar is still loose. And when we throw the wheels on, we'll get everything back on the ground. Final stage, we'll come in, retorque all the control arm bushings at the new ride height, and then we'll start measuring the tires, the axle clearance on the frame, and adjust our track bars to center the axles properly as one of the final steps of the install. Get in there. So one thing to watch, this factory brake line, we want to make sure it's as close to the frame as we can get it. And we might even want to cut this link. In fact, I think we might do that because the sway bar link sticks far enough through the frame. On my Jeep anyway, as the suspension moved up and down, it caught that brake line and bent it. So I think we're going to cut a little bit off the end of that upper link just to make sure, because there's way more than we need going through there. So I think we're going to cut off a good 1/4 inch off the end of that. This is in there pretty darn close, and we want to make sure that we don't hit that. Okay, so we've installed the rear suspension on the Jeep. We've put the tires back on. We've still got a couple of steps back there we're going to go. Once we get everything on, we'll retorque all the control arms. Then we'll measure, readjust the track bars and set those, and then we'll button everything up. But just to see with the rear suspension done, well, we haven't measured how much lift we got, but I'm going to guess about 3 inches of lift probably over where we were. So now we've got our new parts in, and we're going to install the new parts in the front. All right, so we've got our rear suspension installed. We're moving to the front now. We're going to jack the Jeep up, put jack stands under the frame right behind the lower control arms, pull the wheels, and start dismantling the front suspension. All our suspensions before, especially on older Jeeps, the bolts have rusted or hard to get to. People use WD-40 or PB Blaster, other penetrating sprays. I like Aero Coil. I've been using this for a long time. It's expensive. Price shop this online. But this stuff is really great. And when we're getting ready to take suspensions apart, anything that's going to come loose, shock bolts, shock mounts, sway bar links, also our adjustment sleeves. We won't do anything with the tie rod, but on the steering drag link, when you lift the Jeep, the steering wheel will be clocked. It won't be straight anymore. So we're going to loosen that sleeve up and adjust it, and it just, sometimes you can't get those to move if they're rusted in place. This stuff really is my favorite of all of the penetrating sprays we've used over the years. This absolutely works the best. So we're going to spray some of these parts before we start dismantling them, and then we're going to go ahead and take the front suspension apart just like the rear. We're going to take off the shocks, the sway bar links, the track bar. We're going to droop the axle down, pull the coils out, and then we'll start reassembling the suspension back together with new stuff. Okay, so we've dismantled the front suspension on the JK. The track bar comes out, that's 2 bolts. Sway bar links are out on both sides. The shocks, these shocks for whatever reason did not want to come out. The top nut on there was just frozen. It's a locking nut anyway, but they were frozen. So we had Tom get the torch out and just make quick work and take those off of there. I've never seen shocks come off that hard before that we couldn't get them off, but that made quick work of that. We got the shocks off. So front shocks, track bar, sway bar links are off. That's pretty much the front suspension. We're getting ready to droop the suspension down so we can pull the old coils out. And before we do that up front, we want to go ahead and remove the factory brake line from the frame so that can come down, and we'll put our JKS drop brackets here and drop those down as well. We'll do the other side, drop it down, remove the coils. All right, so we're going to install the JKS brake line extension bracket in the front. You've got your brake line, and then you've got your ABS line. The ABS line is not long enough, so, well, it is long enough, but it's attached on the back side of this shock tower with a couple of push pins. So we just push that out of the way, and that allows us some more slack on that line to come down. The JKS line bolts to the factory line, and then we've got to reform that hard line. We'll bend it down slightly, and that'll allow us to extend the brake lines down for the extra travel that we have in the Old Man Emu shop. So we'll reform that, bolt this back into the factory location. This is bolted together, and that'll allow us to droop that down, and then we'll remove the coils. One thing I forgot to mention, when we're drooping the front suspension, the diff breather tube in the front is attached to this brake bracket with another little zip tie multi-mount. So I like to clip that and release that. And then we've released our ABS line from back there. And then I like to go ahead and take this on the later model JKs. There's a piece that bolts the brake line in here, and I want to just free that up so we can get more droop. There's a 10mm bolt right here, so we pull that one bolt. It allows that whole assembly to pop out. Now we've got plenty of brake line slack to droop the axle. So let's go ahead and droop it and pull the coils out. Okay, we're going to droop the front suspension down now. Everything's loose that needs to be loose. So we're going to lower this down and get these coils out of here. So they're going to run 35-inch tires on this Jeep before too long, and we will need to extend the bump stops on this suspension. I like to leave the factory bump stops in the top and extend it up from the bottom. Our DPG bump stop extensions, rather than the 2 or 3 inch extended bump stops, we use single 1-inch pucks that are stackable. And the nice thing about that is at any point down the road, or different tire changes or fender options you get, is you need to adjust the bump stop. Those will slide right through the coils. You can put a ratchet through and reduce or extend the bump stop an inch at a time without having to pull the coils out. So while we're not too worried about that today, we're going to go ahead and drill our holes before we put the coils in the first time to be able to add and subtract bump stop as we need to down the road. So we're going to reinstall the front coils. We've got the front suspension dismantled, and we're going to go in with our new coils. I want to talk about one of the most misunderstood subjects that I have run into in 20 years of building Jeeps. There's a final phase in any good suspension lift that calls for a little fine tuning when it's all said and done. I get people that have asked me for many, many years which coils will make the Jeep sit a certain way, and what we want to do is find the coil that makes the Jeep ride, handle, and perform a certain way, because we can alter how it sits when it's all said and done. So with Old Man Emu, for example, some of their coils and some of their vehicle designs are designed like a lot of factory vehicles, to leave the vehicle with a little rake, so the back will be slightly taller for carrying loads. If you're loaded or towing a trailer or whatever, if you start with a little rake, you're not squatting down so low when you're loaded. But there are some people that want a little rake. There are some people that want their Jeep level. They think without a load, they want it perfectly level. Or some people that like it lower in the back and higher in the front. And you can achieve any of those things with the same springs. So we want to get the springs that ride a certain way, and then if we want to tune the stance a little bit, that's what small trim spacers are for. These are Old Man Emu, they call them a trim packer. These are just a 3/8 inch or 10 millimeter thick, so for very minor stance tuning, these are great. Okay, we're gonna go ahead, we've got the springs in place, we've jacked the axle back up, we've got some pressure on the springs. We're gonna go ahead and install the shocks and the JKS disconnects for the front sway bar. This is not a Rubicon model, so to go off-road, they'll want to be able to disconnect the sway bar. Make sure and follow the package instructions on JKS disconnects explicitly. I have seen these things installed so many wrong ways, I can't even count them. So make sure you follow the directions. JKS makes an excellent product. They are the originators of the sway bar disconnect. They're the innovators today as well. Love these, been running these for 20 years. One thing I do on our shocks with the Old Man Emu shocks, we've got the old style can shock guard as opposed to a shock boot, for example, or an open shock where the shaft is open. If it's open, it can get salt spray or sand or whatever that pits the shaft. A pitted shaft goes through the shock seal, blows the seal, the shock is blown. The shock boots, a lot of those are a big accordion that just every time it moves up and down, it sucks air in there, it sucks dust in there, it sucks moisture in there. If it's zip tied around the base of the shock, it holds moisture and dirt in there, it rusts the inside of the shock. And I've seen other shocks blown out, leaking oil, although the outside of the shock looked fairly new, the inside was blown because of that. So I like the Old Man Emu. They've stayed traditional with an old guard. The newer style Sports Series shocks have the black upper guards on them, where the old ones were yellow. But it's open on the bottom, so it protects the shaft inside. It's open, it drains completely. It's an old school design that I think probably should have been left alone. Again, these are takeoff shocks that came from my rig. They're in great shape. They've just got some gravel spray from my gravel road I live on. But I want to point out one thing that we do. I like to compress the shock completely, stand it up on a bench and just compress the shock until the can is all the way down. And then I'll take a Sharpie marker and draw a line around the base of the shock. And just for kicks, I drew another one where the center of the shock travel is right in the middle. But the important thing about the line around the base is when that shock is fully compressed, I know where full compression is. So when we go to tune bump stops and we're checking tire to fender clearance, and we're also wanting to know how much shock travel we have left, because I want to do that on the trail and not with some floor jack and pretend I can generate the kind of forces needed to set this up correctly. I want to do it in the vehicle on an actual obstacle that will flex the suspension hard. Basically, we want to tune the suspension to where the suspension is jammed hard, either just before the tire can hit the fender or just before the shock is bottomed out. In a perfect world, both of those would happen at the same time, but again, depending on variables in tire size, wheel back spacing, fender flare, opening size, and whatnot, those things will vary. But if the shock bottoms out before the bump stop's done, then the shock has become the bump stop. So if we mark that, then we know when that can drops down, I know exactly where that shock is bottomed out at. So we're going to go ahead and install our shocks back in. Again, very simple. The disconnects, the front track bar, and we're going to set this down on the front tires and see what we've got. All right, we've got our front suspension all buttoned up. The shocks are installed, coils are in place. The track bar is bolted in. We're leaving that loose for now. We're going to start taking side-to-side measurements. Our JKS disconnect mounting posts are installed. One of the last things we'll do is JKS disconnects will get installed with the Jeep setting on the ground, and we'll adjust one disconnect to orient the angle of the sway bar, and then we'll adjust the other disconnect to come on and off smoothly with that. So we're going to throw the tires on this thing and take a look and see how it sets. Okay, we've got most of the suspension installed on the Wrangler for the Ultimate kit. We've got it setting back down on its wheels again. We like the stance. We added the trim packer spacer in the front to make it more level than instead of having a little bit of rake. So now, with everything back down on the ground, we've retorqued the control arms at the new ride height, and the next step now is to adjust the track bars so that we make sure the Jeep and the axles under the Jeep are centered from side to side. After that, we will install the front JKS disconnects and tune those correctly, then we'll clock the steering wheel back where it goes and we should be ready for a test drive. Okay, now we can just tell visually, but we want to adjust the track bar so that we center the axles under the vehicle. And the way we like to do that is just take a tape measure on both sides of the Jeep. We're going to measure into the frame. I'm going to use the top of the coil bucket mount here. And I'm just going to put a tape measure there, and I'm going to come out and find a point on the tire that is the same on both sides of the vehicle. In this case, these little outer tread blocks here are in a straight line, so we're going to measure from here. We've got 14¼ inches on that tread block. So then we're going to go to the other side and measure that and see what the difference is. And then, for example, depending on the difference, if we're an inch off, then you want to shorten or lengthen the track bar by, if it was an inch, we want to shorten or lengthen it 1/2 inch and shift the axle whichever direction, remount the track bar, and then we'll measure again. We're looking for the same amount of distance between the tire and the frame for clearance. If you do that, you'll see the tire should be the same distance out from under the flare on both sides of the vehicle. So we'll go measure the other side, we'll adjust the track bar, we're going to do the same thing in the rear, center these axles up, then we'll tighten down the track bars, and then we'll move to the disconnects, we'll reclock that steering wheel, and we're driving. All right, all of our suspension is installed. We've retorqued everything, all the track bars are adjusted, the control arms are retorqued. Everything is done. The last couple of things we want to do, one, we're going to put our disconnects on, and what we did first was orient the sway bar operating angle and set the disconnect to the right length to set that operating angle. Then we're going to go to the other side and set that length where the disconnect slides on and off easily based on that angle. We'll just mimic that on the other side. Once we have that, we'll tighten our jam nuts down, and that will have our disconnect set. And then the last thing we will do after that is come to this adjusting sleeve here. When we've lifted the Jeep, the steering wheel will no longer be clocked correctly. The Jeep will be going straight down the road, the steering wheel will be crooked. So we will get back in, and we've just loosened these two bolts, and we will turn this adjusting sleeve as needed to lengthen or shorten that drag length to reclock that steering wheel back where it belongs. This bottom link down here is the tie rod, which doesn't change on the JK. It goes knuckle to knuckle, so the toe end is roughly the same as it was before. So all we need to do at this point, you can go do an official alignment if you want to, but you just reclock this upper link here to reclock the steering wheel, and you're driving. You may want to drive it and see how it's clocked. After you've done it the first time, you might find it's off just a little bit. You want to go back in and shorten or lengthen it again to get a final set on that steering wheel, and that is it. We've torqued our wheels down, everything's done, so the disconnects and the adjustment on the steering wheel in this project is complete. All right, we've completed the installation of our ultimate hybrid kit on Mark and Jill's JK. We just got back from a pretty spirited test drive. It just really reminds me every time we do one of these how much I really like these suspension systems. The Old Man Emu springs and shocks coupled with JKS track bars and sway bar links to pull all that geometry together. It just excites me every time we go for a test drive. We did this install in my personal home garage without a lift or anything special, just to give our customers understanding of what they'll be dealing with when they do it in their own garages. I'm out in the country, we live on a real loose gravel road, and even though the Jeep's very tight, firm, and responsive, the Old Man Emu ride is there. We got on the pavement and went through some tight turns and fast turns, and the handling is very, very tight and responsive, very sporty feeling. The Jeep they test drove before this wasn't that way. Every time they went around a corner, they felt like they were going to fall over. The combination of ride and handling we get out of these suspension packages has always been a joy for me. I really enjoy building them and driving them. To have the capability to do 80 down the freeway or disconnect the sway bar and go hit the trails and be equally confident in both areas, fantastic. Hopefully that helps for those of you that are going to be installing this suspension or any suspension on your JK. There should be a lot of good tips here to help you do that. And from Dirk at DPG Off-Road, thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.